AI is now, of course, also shaping warfare in ways that might have seemed sci-fi 3, 4 years ago.
There are four categories of what AI can do for any Department of Defense around the world, whether it's in India or here. We live in an age in which open source intelligence really now is
Matters.
almost everywhere. Indications and warning is a ripe model for both Indian government and United States government to build these capabilities, because you want to know when the Chinese are moving towards the Indian border. You want to be ahead of that.
Today, I'm excited to have with us Ylli Bajraktari, the currently president and CEO of the Special Competitive Studies Project, SCSP. Prior to launching SCSP, Ylli served as the executive director of the National Security Commission on AI. Prior to that, he served as chief of staff to the National Security Advisor, has held a variety of leadership roles for the former Deputy Secretary of Defense, Bob Work, and has served as special assistant to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dempsey, as well.
It is really hard to write a national technology strategy from a government perspective. Congress stepped in and created the AI Commission, in the first in many, many years public-private model in which you have private sector leaders some of the major tech companies from Google, Amazon, Oracle, Microsoft, hand in hand with former government officials and academic leaders as a commission to look at ways for how United States can stay ahead in the AI. Our main competitor, that is a full spectrum competitor, China, is also racing ahead to get ahead in this technology. In Ukraine, in terms of satellite overhead, a lot of private sector companies that are in the business of satellite imagery were able to provide real-time evidence of Russian movements towards the Ukraine, right?
Yeah.
So this was no longer some classified government satellite that only them had knowledge about what Russia is doing on the ground. Palantir and many other companies you have in this space now that have emerged since the release of ChatGPT that give you more options.
How do you see AI and cyber warfare evolving?
During the times of conflict, if your adversary happens to control maybe a social media platform, digital infrastructure, space connectivity, you can only imagine how they can go after a certain population on our system. AI will enable these massive attacks to occur.
Talk to us about the Chinese, according to you, 4 or 5 things that you think the US and India need to be collaborating on.
During
Talk to us
NSCAI,
about
we
maybe
argued
the
that
top
US and
3,
India
4,
need to
5
have a
things that you
tech
think the
alliance.
US and
India has
need
some
to
of the
be
best tech
collaborating
companies in
on.
the world.
During NSCAI, we argued that US and India
has
need
some
to
of
have
the
a
best
tech
universities
alliance.
in the world.
India has some
We
of
have
the
some of
best
the
tech
best
companies
universities
in the world.
in the world.
We have some of the
India
best
is
tech
known as a
companies in the
software
world.
country.
India has some of the best
But as
universities
companies
in the
are
world.
leaving China,
We have
India
some of
has
the
to
best
become a hardware
universities in the
country.
world.
The next
India is known
muscle
as
that
a
would
software
argue
country.
that India has to
But
build.
as companies
in
are
terms of
leaving
moving,
China, India has to become a
forward
hardware
this
country.
century. The next muscle that would argue that India has to build in terms of moving forward this century.
So what I wanted to start us off with is to ask you actually how you've arrived at that intersection of tech, national security, and competitiveness. Like,
Yeah.
talk to us about how you got to
Yeah,
that
yeah.
intersection in particular.
No, thank you. Again, it's an honor to be on your podcast, and I look forward to the conversation. Look, life happens really in some interesting ways, I would argue. How I got to the intersection of AI and technology. As you mentioned, I worked for Secretary Bob Work when he was the number 2 in the Pentagon, and he was a passionate leader about emerging tech, specifically AI. So we're talking about 2014 through 2017. This is before most of us even knew what AI is or what it stands for, or even the people that were working AI were still skeptical we're going to make major breakthroughs, because so many instances before this we had the AI winter, and so people were still skeptical whether or not we're going to get to the next level of AI models in this space. But Bob Work, through his knowledge, strategic insights, he was one of the leaders that I worked for that really put AI and automation at the forefront of the Pentagon leaders. And when you are the number 2 guy in the Pentagon, that makes a huge difference. It pushes the bureaucracy beyond belief. And so I was introduced to AI and the importance of AI and automation in that space during that time in my career. But what was happening at the same time in parallel is that technology, as you mentioned, was really moving into a center position as a source of competition. And I think Eric Schmidt, our chair, really coined the term innovation power, because we're used to thinking traditionally about nations in terms of military power, economic power, financial power. But I think increasingly innovation power, with the technology at the center of that, really becomes a predominant feature in how nations are competing against each other, how they're getting organized, what kind of financial down payments they're making for capabilities, for hardware, software, you name it. And so, as I mentioned, life really happens in interesting ways. I was asked to lead the AI Commission that Congress created from 2018 to 2021. And when you look back, why Congress created that commission was that they saw two trend coming our way. Number one is, in 2018, you were already hearing the sparks of why AI will be different than previous technological revolutions. People were talking in these great grandiose terms that it's going to be like fire, like electricity, like wheel. And everything that Congress was hearing from the private sector was that, it's a really powerful technology, and it's a, general purpose technology with a lot of dual purposeness, as we call it.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand, when you look back in 2018 and 2021, I think this is the era in which there was a wider realization that the China we got is not the China we hoped for, because what you see probably in the last year of the Obama administration, and I was there with Secretary Work and late Secretary Carter, if you look back at their speeches from 2015, late 2015, people are already talking about a great power competition, which was later coined formally in the national security strategy that the Trump administration adopted. But I think by late 14 and 15, there was a broad recognition that this is a different China than the one we have hoped for since the acceptance of China in the WTO. And so I think at that point, Washington and the national security departments and agencies started viewing China in a different light.
Yeah.
I think the national security strategy that Nadia Shadlow drafted and General McMaster provided that overarching guidance is a major document in this century, because after many, many decades probably of viewing China as a country that we should help with the rise because it will become a rational international actor, finally that document really turns the page in terms of how we view China. And from then on, you have all these other documents, which is like how our structure works. That when you have the national security strategy, then the DoD has a national defense strategy, State Department has a strategy, and national intelligence strategy. But the one thing I would say is that all these documents didn't have technology as a dominant feature. When you look at the NSS, and I was there with Nadia and General McMaster, we do mention artificial intelligence. But it's still because technology is happening outside of because technology is happening outside of government. It is really hard to write a national technology strategy from a government perspective. So I thought Congress stepped in and created the AI Commission, and we were fortunate to really work in a first in many, many years public-private model in which you have private sector leaders, some of the major tech companies from Google, Amazon, Oracle, Microsoft, hand in hand with former government officials and academic leaders as a commission to look at ways for how United States can stay ahead in the AI, and B, what are our national security departments and agencies doing with AI and what they can do more. I have to remind you that this is also the pre-ChatGPT era, in which AI was still happening in small corners of each of the departments and agencies, but it was not a dominant topic of large conversations and everything else. And so we produced the major report in March of 2021, 759 pages, which is a really thick report for a congressional commission. But that report really kickstarted a lot of things, a lot of investments, a lot of organizational approaches to how we should be approaching AI from a government perspective, right? And then I don't have to tell you that the post-ChatGPT release, just you see an explosion of interest and attention and everything else we need to do as a government, as Congress, as a society, in terms of how we get ourselves organized for the AI era.
Yeah. So before we get into SCSP, right, which I want to get into in a few minutes, but let's stick with the NSCAI, right? So I think it's a great. I think you hit the ball on the head when I think it's a great example of public and private sector coming together, right, on an issue that, as you rightly also point out, that at that time at least was still a little bit of a forward-looking issue. It hadn't really gathered as much of mainstream attention as it has since ChatGPT. So, a couple of questions on that. Let's dig deeper into that, right? So, one is, how did it come about, right? Was it led
Mhm.
by the government to say, okay, now let's start something like this for the
Mhm.
Congress, and now let's pull in the private sector? Or was it more the pull of or push of the private sector to say, let's do something like that, but make sure the government isn't on it? Or was it a more collaborative thing? So, one. And second, when you look back at it, would you have done the structure of that commission differently?
Mhm. Great question. On to your first point, or to your first question, I would argue that it was both. I think it was a push from the private sector to alert the government that, hey, this is coming,
This is coming.
um, and we should think about how we're going to approach it. And I think also it was a recognition on the side of the congressional leadership, that, it's fine if technology is happening on one end, but this is not happening in vacuum, because our main competitor, that is a full spectrum competitor, China,
Correct.
is also racing ahead to get ahead in this technology. By that time, they had a clear strategy that they wanted to be the global AI leader by 2030. And so it was both, I think, dynamic, that led Congress to create a commission. So that's number one. The most famous commission in our lifetime is the 9/11 Commission. So Congress created these commissions. I was told usually on two cases. Number one is something goes bad, and then you need to create a commission, a bipartisan commission, to look at what went wrong and what are the steps we need to undertake not to
Correct.
repeat that again. And I think 9/11 probably falls under that category. And the second is when there's a policy vacuum or lack of ownership on a certain policy issue that the executive branch alone cannot fix. And so Congress, in a bipartisan fashion, creates a commission, and then different committees based on the topic. In our case, it was the national defense committees, so committees that deal with the Pentagon, with the intelligence community, with commerce. They were in charge of picking these individuals from private sector, academia, former high-level individuals to come as a group. So we had 15 commissioners to come as a group and create that core commission structure and look into this problem set. And so that's how they created that. In hindsight, would I have changed something else, to be honest with you? Now, look, as you know, technology is an evolving thing. Like, initially, I remember the first time we had a conversation about hardware, and I was the first guy. My job was to serve as executive director. So I told the commissioner, I said, look, I'm hesitant to add hardware because, once you start adding things to your mission becomes about everything and anything, and then it's hard to deliver. But I'm glad that was voted down on my suggestion, because later on, as you know now, hardware becomes a central feature of these AI models. And if it wasn't for us to write Chapter 4, I don't think we would get to the CHIPS Act later on passed by Congress. So you have to be careful about, like, what are the things that are directly related to your mission, and, as you said, what are the things that are supporting your mission. And I think hardware was one of the things that I'm glad, commissioners like Chris Darby and Eric Schmidt and Louis Gilman recommended that we look into the semiconductor issue, which for me at that time was like, I mean, if we add semiconductors, what is the next thing we have to add? 5G, and other elements that were like really lingering out there. But hindsight is always 2020. And I wish we talked more about the energy, because now in October of 2024, the predominant theme about AI is as it relates to the energy.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that was going to be my other question, right? So I think there's a lot of things that someone as, like yourself, who's been actively involved, people who followed the work of the commission and what has come since, there's a lot of things that one can argue that the commission's work has led to getting right, for the US, right? Whether it's the CHIPS Act that has followed, the focus on China as a competitor in AI, and all the other pieces that have started to be put in place. But I'm going to ask you a slightly different question, which is what did
Yeah.
it not get right?
Yeah.
Right? What did the commission, looking back again, hindsight, what did it not get right? One might be that energy issue that you just alluded to, but were there other things that the commission didn't get right at the time?
I mean, I haven't looked carefully about that because I think every day we continue partially with the work of that commission, even with the SCSP work we do. I would argue we didn't predict the immediate and sort of like a near-term impact that the large language models will have. I think if you asked anybody in 2018 and 19, not many people will make a bet that these large language models are going to make that huge breakthrough and actually put AI in front of all of us.
Yeah.
Because at that point, if you remember, we were still looking at AI from a narrow lens, you know. So that we still were talking about the natural language processing, neural networks, how do we get to image recognition stuff and all these things.
Yeah.
And these were the capabilities that our departments and agencies were also looking into. But I think ChatGPT moment really changed the game completely in favor of the large language models.
Yeah, so you're saying it caught almost like the people who were involved in the commission and others as much by surprise, right? Because as you said, it was a private sector, public sector
Yeah,
collaborative
yeah,
effort.
yeah, yeah.
So one would have thought that people on the commission who were from the valley might have had some inkling of what was brewing.
I mean, look, the key thing was we looked into, as I mentioned, semiconductors, and I think
Yeah,
that was like
you
the
got right.
connection that a
Yeah,
lot of them were making, that you will not be able to get to these next models if you don't have access to the advanced semiconductors.
yeah,
We looked into the resources, because again, like, just to remind you, the mission of the commission was, what are our government agencies doing with AI and what can they do more? you
yeah,
know and so our assessment was that every department and agency has these islands of hopes in terms of how they were treating AI, but we were not organized for that. We were not paying a lot of attention. We didn't
yeah,
put a lot of resources. This is still like being talked on the marginal meetings, but is not giving the attention that it requires. And if you look back, like in 2017 and 18, DoD created JAIC, the Joint AI Center. The intelligence community created another effort, and so people were still, putting organizational pieces in place, but there was no money associated with that.
yeah,
There were a handful of people I remember at that time at each of the departments and agencies that were focused on this issue, but you could tell the sparks were there. And I'll tell you, like, an anecdote that I use generally is, so after my White House tour, I went to the National Defense University to spend a year of my sabbatical. I only was there for 6 months because I was pulled into the AI Commission. And while I was there, I organized the first AI course at the National Defense University. And generally, when you do these seminars at the National Defense University, you would get between 10 and 20 people. I got 95 people to RSVP for that seminar. And this is, generally the military crowd at the colonel, lieutenant colonel level, and the civilians at that level too, right? And even then, so this is 2018, right? November of 18. Even then, you could tell that a lot of people are getting intrigued.
yeah,
The spark is there, but we still didn't know, what does this mean? What does it mean for the military? What does it mean for our national security? What does it mean for our competitiveness, right? And so I think the purpose of the commissioners, and I think how I value their role, is they injected that term of competitiveness and why we need to stay ahead in the technology competition.
yeah,
And how these other elements of the foundations you need to put in place, from the hardware, from the organization principle, from the resources, to get us there.
yeah. No, fascinating. I think that, and then of course, you transition into and set up the SCSP, right? Which again, I would say to the credit of you and other people who are behind SCSP, Eric and others, I think is again a unique organization, right, with a unique mission, right? Unlike a think tank, I would say, right? But talk to us about that, right? About how
Yeah.
the thinking
Yeah.
around that crystallized. I know there was a historical analog
Yeah.
there, but
Yeah.
talk to us about some of that thinking that leads to the disbanding of the commission and leading up to the creation of SCSP.
Absolutely. So, I mean, look, the commission, every commission that Congress creates has a limited time span. There are either 2 or 3 years. Ours was 2.5 years, which was really fortunate because after 2 years we published the report, and then Congress gave us about 6 months for us to go out and socialize the report. Again, like we're talking about 2020, 21 before ChatGPT, in which you had to do a lot of education, a lot of socializing about what AI is. I remember we would go and brief, you name it, and we would walk in and I would introduce myself as the executive director of the AI Commission, and people wanted to talk to me about 5G. And so different times, like a different reality in which we live today compared to like a couple of years ago.
Yeah,
So that's one piece. The second piece is, towards the end of the commission, Eric was drafting his book with Dr. Kissinger called The Age of AI. And Dr. Kissinger told Eric and spoke fondly about the initiative he led in the 50s called Special Studies Project, which was, I never heard about this initiative, but Dr. Kissinger in the 50s, at the behest of Nelson Rockefeller, brought together the best and the brightest we had to look at how do we frame the competition against Soviet Union. We didn't call it a competition back in the 50s, as you can imagine, but we were caught up by surprise with the launch of the Sputnik satellite, which was a awakening call for our nation about how our main competitor, rival, whatever you want to call it, is getting ahead in a major technology of that age, which was, space race. And they brought together the best and the brightest we had from private sector, academia, and government to look at how we can look into this competition. And so after 3 years of work, they published this book called Prospect for America. It became a bestseller. It got sold $1.25. I found a copy on Amazon for about $99. And when I read it, it's a fascinating read because it really provides that intellectual framing of the competition. And what are the steps we need to undertake in terms of our economy, our education, our society to really get ourselves organized against Soviet Union. And so Dr. Kissinger mentioned that to Eric. Eric and I sat down. Eric was like, look, I'm happy to continue the journey of NSCI because even in 2021, we pushed a lot of recommendations to Congress, but a lot of them were still left hanging out there. And so you needed a body that is really focused on what I call it tech-first national security approach to advocate and push and educate the broader public on these issues because they're critical, right? And so in October of 2021, we created the Special Competitive Studies Project. I added competitive in our title because when I called Bob Work and socialized this idea with him, he was like, Ylli, we are in competition with China. And in the competition, you either win or lose. So you have to be clear about what you stand for. So you got to add competitive in the title. So that's why it's Special Competitive Studies Project. I know it's a mouthful of acronym. But honestly, like the purpose of SCSP is twofold. Number one is continue the discourse and the ideas that the NSCI put forward. And the second piece is I really believe that 2025, 2030 is the major time or probably the most critical time of this century. Why do I say that? If you look at the geopolitical scene right now, it feels like all the stars are aligned for the end of this decade to be really critically important. If you look at where the technology space is going, where China is going, if you look at the EVs, just in one sector alone, and what has China managed to do in that space, I mean, as we've talked at the beginning of this podcast, technology really is the center of competition. The innovation power is becoming the center power of how nations are going to be viewed going forward. And if we don't win this technology competition by the end of this decade, I think the rest of this century really becomes much more complicated for all the democratic nations, India including. I'm not saying this is just a competition between United States and China. This is a competition between the democratic world, a set of allies and partners and friends versus what we call it axis of disruptors, China, North Korea, Iran, and Russia. And their approach to the world, to the worldview, and the vision of the world they want to build.
Yeah. No, I think, I couldn't agree more, right? In my own book, the subtitle is, what I call the great tech game. I mean, that's the term I tried to
Yeah.
coin.
No, I agree with you 100%.
It's,
And your thesis, your book. Yeah.
this is the new great game, right? And tech is very much at the center of it. It's a global game, multiplayer, more global game, right? With tech being the key driver of competitiveness today. So couldn't agree more with the framing. But I'll ask you a question that I got a lot, right? When I wrote that book, and I'll mention. So I used to work at McKinsey, both in New York and DC, both in the public sector and private sector clients. And of course, companies are very used to thinking of competitive strategy. Surprisingly, and maybe this is less so the case with the US, but surprisingly, with many other countries in the world, Lily, that's not as obvious to many countries, right? So countries don't come up with competitiveness strategies, actually. And to that extent, I think the work that you're doing, the SCSP, and of course the work that you've done prior, from a competitiveness standpoint, is unique, right? As I see it. So tell me why, according to you, does a country need a competitiveness strategy? And also, given that, as you also said earlier in the podcast, right, when tech is no longer in the hands of governments, right? It's really at the in the scope of the private sector today, largely. How do you come up with a strategy at a government level that can somehow apply to a country which includes both the public and the private?
No, these are great questions, and I think, look, I don't think anybody has gotten this right yet, and I think it's okay, because here's the thing. Look, we were used to the Cold War mentality thinking, in which government and innovation happen inside government, right? In the United States, at least, most of the innovation happened in government labs,
Yeah,
or universities that were directly or indirectly funded by government,
funded
right?
by
And there was a big geopolitical factor for us to innovate and out innovate Soviet Union, because there was a big, we didn't call it a competition, but it was a Cold War,
yeah,
two ideological competitions happening globally, right? And so you were pushed to out innovate and outmaneuver your adversary, right? Then I think the end of the Cold War happens, in which I think globalization, world integrated into markets, into the technologies, became sort of like a dominant feature of how we got ourselves organized, how we get our economy organized, and whatnot. And this is the time also when the China really opened up to the world and it began its rise. And so, to go back to my earlier point, I think it took us probably like a long time to realize that what China was doing is not growing and rising to become a rational actor, but actually they were being organized, they were investing in technologies and all aspects of the economy, the like competitiveness, so they can dominate that space.
yeah,
And so if you look at the deployment of 5G globally, I think that was probably a Sputnik moment for a lot on the government side. And I was inside the government during that time, in which you have a technology that is developed by private sector on our system, but it's not getting a lot of attention. And on the China, you have an understanding that we're talking about the future of connectivity, future of digital infrastructure, future of data flows, and they have a company or a handful of companies that they're going to subsidize and
yeah,
help them deploy globally.
yeah,
So when you look at the world map, it was at that time when we were looking at that world map, it was predominantly red.
yeah. I
Like,
have that map in my book. That's right. It
yeah,
looks,
exactly. And so you know what I'm talking about. And
yeah,
so I think that was the wake up call. I mean, if I would call it a today's Sputnik moment, that would probably be a Sputnik moment
yeah,
on our side, in which you go like, oh, okay, like this is not just about a company that has a remarkable technological advancement in telecommunication, but it's actually a government, political party, a authoritarian regime that is doubling down and it's pushing it around the world
yeah,
in order for them to build this global connectivity. And ever since then, if you look at it, look, even in 2019-20, Xi Jinping was pretty clear about the list of technologies they are doubling down, investing, and they want to dominate globally, right? I think 5G was one of them, AI was another one, and it was a list of 9 technologies. And I remember when Eric called me and was like, "Hey, what is the United States list of technologies that we want to stay ahead?"
Yeah.
And I didn't have the list
We
because
don't
I
have
was working on AI. Our system is designed in that way. This goes back to my other point: is like we're not designed as a government to do net assessments, or technological net assessment. We did net assessment, and we just published last week our latest updates on the technologies that we are ahead, or the China is ahead, and the one that are contested. But our government was not positioned to do a net assessment of technologies. We traditionally, during the Cold War, did the military net assessment, in which you knew how many tanks Soviet
That's-
Union has versus us, aircrafts, Navy carriers. But on the technology, it's a really difficult assessment to conduct
so it's
because, yeah,
almost that you've got to, it's almost like one of the things that China had gotten right at the time, which was causing, let's say people in the US to worry, right? People like you and Eric, was that they had managed to achieve this kind of collaboration between the private sector and public sector, right? To put it in slightly more
yeah,
uh, nice terms, that is much harder to achieve in a country like, let's say, the US or even a country like India, right? Where the private sector is actually distinct in its objectives and its strategies. Government, where there they were able to achieve that for reasons endemic to their political structure. How do you think countries like India or the US, which are there's a clear distinction between the private and the public often. How do you manage to blur that line without becoming a China-like
yeah, yeah,
actor?
yeah. No, I mean that's a really good point, and like as you know, we talk about a competitor that has a similar fusion, right? That
That's right.
their private sector basically will deliver anything to their government or for all sorts of purposes, including military purposes, right? Whereas in our system, private sector has a say in whether they want to work with government or not. And I think that is what makes us special. That's what makes us a democracy, both India and United States. But I would tell you, like, what has changed in our system over the years is I remember when I worked for Bob Work and he issued this famous memo on Project Maven. Some of our private sector companies decided not to work with government.
That's right.
And but I think that has changed over time. And I think what has changed is that China actually helped us there. Because over time, as China was uncovering their real ambition about what they wanted to do with these technologies, number one is their purpose was to control minorities through surveillance techniques and deploying of all these capabilities to do population control domestically and occasionally even export that capability to certain countries. I
Yeah.
think that was a wake up call for our tech companies.
The
So that
private.
was number one. I think Ukraine also was a wake up call for a lot of our tech companies
Yeah.
because you saw a dictator or a ruthless leader like Putin invading a country for no reason, and technology played a critical role in terms of like how we set up the Ukrainians for the initial successes of that invasion.
Yeah.
So I think it has been a shift in the dynamics. Obviously, if you're a private sector leader and you see that your global market share is shrinking because of unfair economic practices deployed by China, whether or not they're stealing your IP, whether or not they're copy pasting your products and then deploying it subsidized globally, I think that is also a wake up call for the private sector leaders, both in India and United States, to go like, oh, okay, we are in a different competitive environment,
Yeah, the
and we
rules.
are facing a competitor that is not playing with the rules of the road set up by the international community for the last couple of decades.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, absolutely. I think the when the rules of the game are different, and when as you rightly said, it's almost like all's fair in love and war and competition, great power competition. Let's dig deeper into some of your recent work at SCSP, Ylli, which I found to be very interesting as well and insightful. You've put out challenges for US competitiveness report, I think now a couple of years ago. A more recent report on mid-decade opportunities, again for the that vision for competitiveness report. Talk to us about those reports, right? And
Yeah,
talk to
yeah,
us
yeah.
about what are some of the core recommendations coming out of those reports for the US, um, that you think are critical in this next sort of 5 to 6 year time frame?
Yeah.
Given that 25 to 30, 2025 to 30 piece is a critical determining point for how this competition will play out.
No, thank you for that question. So first of all, let me talk a little bit of background about both documents. The first one is called Mid-Decade Challenges to National Competitiveness, and the second one is Vision for Competitiveness. When we produced the first one in October of 2022, we wanted to produce a document that outlines the challenges and opportunities you have. I know it sounds cliche, of the steps you need to undertake between 2022 and 25 to be better positioned for this 2025, 2030, maximum dangerous, period of our lifetime that John McMaster calls it. And so from 2022 to 2023, we produced that report. And we opened the report actually with a chapter that says, what if China wins? And so we depict a world in which you and I can easily wake up in 2025 in which China has won the technology competition.
Yeah.
And I can walk you through that scenario. It's not a sci-fi scenario, but it's a really, if you allowed the trends from 2022 continue in the technology space, you could easily foresee an environment in which you wake up and you have a world in which the digital infrastructure globally is owned by Chinese. Most of the online platforms are owned by Chinese, and most of your data, one way or another, goes through the CCP servers back in Beijing, right? So we wanted to really project forward that potential scenario that all of us could face if we allow that competition to go unaddressed or unchallenged, right? Yeah. And so that was the purpose of that document.
I would say it's almost like, I don't know if you see the parallels. It's almost like what Eric was saying back in 2018, etc. That in that 2018-19 timeframe, that listen, our lead against China is really, really slim.
Yeah.
3 years down the line, that lead will not be there, right?
And no, absolutely right. And the other thing I would say is, people think that there's an end point to the technology competition. I would argue that it's not, because technology evolves almost every day, every second. You always have to be dynamic when it comes to this competition. So you always have to go faster, as Eric says, and you always have to outmaneuver and outpace your competitor, right? Otherwise, this is how private sector operates, right? If you see what the private sector or the release of these models that has happened in the last 2+ years, is almost every month or two you have a release of a better, powerful model, because every company is trying to stay ahead.
Yeah. No, I call it waves, Ylli. So I call it waves.
Yeah, that's a great one.
There are waves.
Yeah.
You might have ridden the first wave really well, and you were the great surfer.
Exactly.
Rode the first wave really well, but there's another one coming.
Exactly.
If you don't have your eye on that one,
you lose. Yeah.
One is gone now, right?
That's a great point. Yeah.
Matters, yeah.
And we said this thing in the first report when people asked us, especially when they were asking Eric, is China or US ahead? He would say, like, United States is ahead, but China is catching up fast. And you can see it, you can see, like, whether it's 18 months, 12 months, or 6 months, but you always want to be ahead, but you don't want to stop.
Because your competitors... These two documents were now broader than AI, right? I mean, these are now, so unlike the AI Commission work, this is now much broader. So talk to us about what that scope looks like for competitiveness.
Yeah, so if you look back at the AI Commission's report, Chapter 16 really, which probably a lot of people didn't pay attention, but the way we designed Chapter 16 was really in response to Eric's question: is what is the United States list of technologies that we have to stay ahead?
Yeah.
In Chapter 16 already starts talking about what are the list of technologies, right? It's not just AI, because AI is one of the technologies, but AI is also going to fundamentally drive forward other technologies. Think about biotech, quantum, and everything else. And so what we did with SCSP the first year is we did a net assessment. What are the technologies that are critical for the future of nations? Technologies that are general purpose technologies, dual purpose technologies that can drive fundamental change in terms of your health, in terms of your economy, your national security, military capabilities, right? So we came up with a list of 6 technologies, right? And so we continue to always talk about those 6 technologies because they're all intertwined. They all have hardware, software, data associated with them, but also they are critically important for the future of everything we're going to do.
And what are those 6?
So AI, obviously, and next generation AI models, which I think in the next couple of years, we should be serious about how we talk about artificial general intelligence. Obviously, semiconductors, with everything that's going on right now, all the investments our government is making and other governments around the world, what is the next generation of semiconductors? Once we reach the end of the Moore's law, so that's two. Third is advanced communication. So we're talking about 5G today, but people are already working on 6G. And then you put on top of that satellite connectivity, which is also emerging as a serious actor in the United States with the Starlink deployment and other deployments around the world. China is also not behind in the space. So those are three that you have to fundamentally get it right. And then the next three are the future of compute power, which includes quantum. As you know, quantum has always been like 7 to 10 years away, but I think with the advancement of AI, that window will be shortened. And you have amazing companies now that are working in this space, both here and in India, as you know. The fifth technology that we place a lot of emphasis is the future of energy. And here, whether you're talking about the battery, whether you're talking about the fusion of all the elements of energy, which is now, as we talked earlier, getting a lot of attention. You saw the news now, companies purchasing nuclear power plants, revitalizing power plants, a lot of emphasis being on fusion. We have some serious fusion companies now in the United States. We as SCSP, we have a fusion commission that we have launched just because we believe, even fusion that looked distant future many, many years ago, now we have some serious companies that have serious milestones ahead of them to produce fusion energy, right? And so energy is really critical. And then the sixth technology is biotech. I mean, again, with the advancement of AI, biotech now really is on a critical point. I think COVID also helped a lot because there was a lot of investment going into the biotech space. Yeah. And so I think AI plus biotech is that other technology that we all should pay attention to.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think those six technologies seem like a great set of technologies to obviously keep an eye on. And as you know, as we've been saying a few times in this conversation already, you have to remember that technology is dynamic, and this list might be different 2 years from now, if not earlier. But now let's talk about the intersection of technology with warfare, right? Which is the more traditional way that governments have thought about competitiveness, right? So as you were rightly saying, back in the day, you're comparing tank for tank, missile for missile. AI is now, of course, also shaping warfare in ways that might have seemed sci-fi 3-4 years ago. But I think as Ukraine has shown, as I think the Middle East is showing us, that future is again not as far-fetched as people might have believed even 3, 4, 5 years ago. So talk to us about how you are seeing the evolution of AI's intersection with warfare and what's going to be critical to get right there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, look, I don't think it should come as a surprise that if a technology that exists in private sector is not being utilized by both state and non-state actors for warfighting purposes, right? I mean, every nation...
By the way, I just read Unit X as well.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
That's also talking about exactly this point that you're making. That if there's technology sitting in the private sector, it's got to be utilized by...
Absolutely. I mean, both state and non-state actors, whether or not they're legal or illegal entities, they're going to use these things. Somebody said once, I think it was Mark Andreessen, I think the technology gets adopted by tech enthusiastic first, and then crooks second, and then government regulators third, right? And so we've seen with the cyber warfare how that has evolved over the years, from the moment we talked about cyber to then, cyber crimes, all the ransomware, all these things that are happening in today's life, right? So I think it shouldn't be as a surprise that even AI and other emerging tech will be used, by rational, non-rational actors for warfighting purposes. And you mentioned, we see that in Ukraine predominantly, and you have then, instances in Middle East as well. I would argue that first, I always like to debunk the myth of AI for military, because I think there's been a lot of burden put, rightfully so, because of the movies we have watched over the years in terms of how AI is going to look in the battlefield, whether or not it's going to come as a Skynet scenario or a killer robot scenario and all those things. But this is the question that I had to answer as part of the commission we worked on. What can DoD do with AI, to achieve its mission? And I think there are 4 categories of what AI can do for any Department of Defense around the world, whether it's in India or here. Number 1 is, we can see now that AI is really good with back office responsibilities. So like the burden admin processes that most of our bureaucracies, are notorious for, right? Whether it's in here or in Delhi, right? And so I think AI, which is already used by private sector for many, many years, can be easily replacing a lot of those like admin, mundane jobs. I wouldn't say jobs, but it would make life much, much easier for people that are working these jobs. The second category, which I think is the category that's getting a lot of attention right now, is the category of indications and warning. We've seen it in Ukraine. I think AI is really good in terms of behavior prediction, in terms of analyzing vast amounts of data, images, and give you a pattern of what's going to happen next. And we saw that in Ukraine in terms of satellite overhead. A lot of private sector companies that are in the business of satellite imagery were able to provide real-time evidence of Russian movements towards the Ukraine, right?
Yeah.
So this was no longer some classified government satellite that only them had knowledge about what Russia is doing on the ground, and what was probably the ultimate intent, right? You have a lot of companies, Maxar being one of them. I have a fortune to have a friend of mine, Anshu Roy from Rhombus Power, a tremendous leader. His Rhombus Power company does a lot of these predictive analysis, and we had them in our office 30 days before the Russia invasion of Ukraine. And we asked Anshu, like, hey, when do you think this is going to happen? And he said it's going to happen in 30 days. He missed it by a day, right? And so, look, we live in an age in which open source intelligence really now is almost everywhere. It's just a matter of what kind of algorithm, what kind of AI platform we're using to connect these dots, right? And I think indications and warning is a ripe model for both Indian government and United States government to build these capabilities, because you want to know when the Chinese are moving towards the Indian border. You want to be ahead of that, right? And I think these models, with enough space capabilities, and India is really big in space. I think this is a ripe area of a potential collaboration to deepen what we and India do together, and then B, really open source future is up for grabs, because I believe more and more intelligence is going to come from open source sources, right?
Yeah.
The third category I would argue is the decision making. If you have used any of these models, you can always ask these models, hey, give me 3 options to address any given problem, right? And model can give you maybe 5. So it will give you always 2 more options than human brains can figure out, right? Because they have more access to more information. And so I think what you want to give always leaders, whether in our system or in your system, is options, and that's what usually you do when you work in the Pentagon or in the White House. You want to provide your leaders with the best possible set of options, and the pros and cons of those options, their advantages and disadvantages. And I think if you tell these models, say, hey, I'm facing this challenge in Southeast Asia or in South Asia. Hey, I'm thinking of these 3 following options of how we can react, both militarily or diplomatically. What do you have in mind?
What am I missing? Correct. What might I be missing?
And I think it will give you like blind spots you're facing. You might red team your options, which sometimes we fail as humans to look critically at these things. And I think, but you owe it to the decision maker a full set of options. And I think that's what I think these options can play a role there. And then the last
companies like, let's say, Palantir, etc., would be doing today, or
absolutely, yeah. Palantir and many other companies you have in this space now that have emerged since the release of ChatGPT that give you more options. And then the last category, which I think gets most of the attention, is the lethal autonomous weapon systems, in which people associate AI and military right away with a system that will be launched and in the air or during the like execution of the system will be self-updated, which I think It's something that um, our system, at least, and our government takes these things very seriously. I think people think that without being tested and evaluated, these systems will be let in the wild, which is never the case.
Yeah.
When it comes to matter of life and death, our system, or our Department of Defense takes these things very seriously. I mean, there's a department,
As
there's
in,
an office, yeah, there's an office that deals with testing and evaluating of these systems, right? And so I think that area will be probably much more under scrutiny. These systems will not be let to be deployed without proper testing and evaluation and training of soldiers in using these systems. But that is not going to stop rogue nations, rogue actors by being much more risk averse because they don't have constraints that we have as democracies and India has a democracy in terms of like just deploying anything in the field to see what it works. And so
yeah.
you will see, state actors and non-state actors that are much more comfortable with like pushing these things and testing them on the ground. We know for a fact that Russia used an autonomous systems in Syria. It failed, but didn't prevent them from like trying them and testing them. We also know that China doesn't have any document that guides the responsible and ethical use of lethal autonomous weapon systems. On the contrary, our Department of Defense, the first memo issued by Secretary Lloyd Austin was on responsible AI use by the military, right? Yeah. And so you're dealing with these competitors that are not fully transparent about their intent.
Yeah,
there are no red lines.
yeah.
There are no red lines in terms of how they're going to plan to use these systems. So you always have to be on the lookout. You always have to move fast, probably, and adopt these systems faster.
What about AI and cyber warfare, right? I mean, we've seen some major cyber incidents now over the last few years that show you the power of cyber attacks, how they can cripple infrastructure, whether it's oil pipelines or government departments or now airlines and their software. How do you see AI and cyber warfare evolving now in the let's say in the next 2, 3, 4 years?
Yeah. I mean, you really point to a point that I think it was a theme throughout this conversation because I think now technology is no longer just a matter of like private sector, but that this is how technology also becomes part of a critical national security infrastructure and the way of our life, right? Because it can cripple, part of our country, part of our society if it's targeted and it's like multi-purpose, not just for national security attack or military to military attacks, but it's, you have a state, non-state actors attacking like a region and crippling the infrastructure or the power infrastructure of a certain region in our country or of our allies and partners. I like the way we have described AI-enabled cyber attacks in our first NSCI report because I think what AI can do, it can have, if I remember correctly, the word we used is can have a macro, let me just remember this correctly. It can micro-target at a macro level. What we meant by that is, think about it. If you have access to a region or a domain or a portion of your society, and you have such a great knowledge about everyone's behavior, buying patterns, moving patterns, you can micro-target the entire region with these AI-enabled attacks, right? Yeah. And so during the times of conflict, if your adversary happens to control maybe a social media platform, digital infrastructure, space connectivity, you can only imagine how they can go after, a certain population, a certain region on our system or your system, right? Yeah. Because the AI will enable these massive attacks to occur.
Yeah. Tell me now, let's sort of zoom out a little bit, Ylli, like as we look back at the work you've done, right? Both with the National Commission on AI, SCSP now over the last few years. Of course, one part of your strategy is always to get your strategy right. The other piece always has to be to keep an eye on the adversaries. In this case, let's say China's strategy. What are the Chinese, according to you, getting right still?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. I would preface this by saying that everything we talked today, when I talked about the list of technologies, the argument we have made in every document is that this is the list of technologies that we, with our allies and partners, should be ahead. Because if you look at each of these 6 technologies, in none of them United States leads by itself or alone. If you look at digital connectivity, we lead there because of set of allies and partners we have around the world, whether it's Scandinavian countries, India, or Japan, right? If you look at AI, we don't lead there alone. We lead there because we rely on TSMC semiconductors, right? So all these technologies are so intertwined today that our argument has been that we as democracies need to have a list of technologies, and this is that list. And then how do we stay ahead is that each other complement how we build these technologies. Some people will bring human capital. Some countries. I'll repeat this again. Some nations will bring human capital. Some nations will bring technological advancement. Some nation will bring traditional historical knowledge of the certain technologies. But together, we should complement each other and stay ahead in this technology race. What China gets right, I think China is differently organized for this competition. No surprise there because of the political system they have. So they are able to get a top-down drive in terms of like how they push towards achieving end goals in any given technology, right? Secondly, they have enormous resources. When you look at the amount of money they put towards AI, quantum, fusion, these are enormous resources that China is able to dedicate, right, to stay ahead. A third are people. China has, universities that produce still a large number of computer scientists, engineers, which are critical. And we haven't talked about the people component, but really, people component is critical in this technology space, right? And so China has a lot of advantages that they are playing their hand on, and you can see it in the result when you look at some of the amazing tech companies they have produced. No surprise they're getting ahead in social media platform, online retailing, telecommunication, EVs, EVs, batteries, critical minerals, right? No surprise there, right?
Yeah. So clearly, those are the things it's getting right. I mean, so to some extent, it's strategy of having that China 2035, China 25 type plans, figuring out those technologies and sectors it wants to dominate supply chains globally for. It's being able to execute on that still, right? I mean, you still see that solar, EVs. There's still many forward-looking sectors that they're dominating on. When I was writing my book, one of the things I wrote was that in this battle between the U.S. and China, this competition, one of the key advantages, and you alluded exactly to this, that the US still has two things, right? I pointed to one was the talent, right? That you remain the magnet for the best talent around the world, whether it's Europeans, Indians, Israelis, like you name it. Like I think
I'm an immigrant, so like I think that by itself tells you the story of America,
No, that's right. And the other piece is its allies, right? And if you go back to the Cold War again, and partly your mission at SCSP derives from that historical analog, and I feel like at some point the allies there also made a massive difference, right?
Right.
Of course, China happened to be a partner then, which helps at that point. But you alluded to the allies point, and I want to talk to you. One of the things I mentioned in my book is that at that time, again, 21, 22, it seemed like China was devoid of friends and allies.
Yeah.
Whereas the US had a massive list of friends, allies, partners around the world. Today, the situation seems to be looking a bit different to me. Do you worry that this, new axis that is being talked about? Do you worry about that now? This new axis of what are being called autocrats, but if you would just look at China plus allies or plus friends now, compared to 2 years ago, it's looking like a very different picture. Like the Russians were not so much, 2 years ago when my book came out, Russia had not attacked Ukraine. But now that list looks very different. So would you worry about China plus friends and allies today more than you would worry about them 2-3 years ago?
Absolutely. I mean, look, from the technology competition perspective, because this is one of the areas we look closely, is we let a lot of regions of the world go into China's hand because China was there. China was there. They built technological capabilities. They went and they offer it to these countries. We don't do that. Our government doesn't go around the world and tries to sell digital infrastructure to around the world, right? It's just that how we're organized as a country, as a democracy, right? We have a private sector and a government. So what we have done, I think, is we have let the space both to certain regions around the world that China walked in and built capabilities. And secondly, we also abandoned international standards in organizations, where China was able. I was reading like just this last week, the Economist piece talks about the 6G standards and how China, with a set of allies and partners, are moving into the international organizations and trying to set the standards according to them for the next 6G technologies.
That's right.
So, as we talk throughout this podcast, this technology competition is dynamic. You always have to stay ahead. You always have to be alert. You have to be aware that if China moves to a certain country in Latin America to provide a 5G infrastructure, it's a ridiculously cheap cost. There's something more to that, right?
Yeah, there's a strategic angle there, of course. Yeah,
exactly. And so whether or not Soviet Union deployed missiles in Cuba, how do you treat Chinese deployment of these critical technologies in your neighborhood when they can spy, they can use data, they can use this digital infrastructure to their advantage, right? So I just think,
correct.
Exactly. So you just have to be differently, I think, thinking about this competition. And I think we're getting there now. I think there's a wide awakening both here in Delhi that, technology is the center of competition and it's also a matter of national security. But this is an area that we abandoned for many, many years until I said we had the 5G moment and then we had all these like set of strategy documents released by Beijing.
Yeah, let's talk about the US and India, right? I mean, you've already referred to a few areas where the US and India, on the tech front specifically, can collaborate more, right? Talk to us about maybe the top 3, 4, 5 things that you think the US and India need to be collaborating on that maybe they're not yet focused on. That'd be good to get on the top of, let's say the next Modi visit to the US or the next US president's trip to India. What are those top 3 to 5 things you think would be critical and most impactful?
Yeah. Look, I've been bullish about US-India relationship because I covered India when I worked in the Pentagon for 2 years. And to all those naysayers on the US-India relationship, people forget where our relationship was in 2012, 13, 14, before the nuclear deal. And then, I was in the Pentagon and I traveled with the Secretary Panetta when he announced the Defense, Trade, and Technology Initiative that late Secretary Carter led, which was aimed to remove the technological barriers we had in improving our mill-to-mill relationship. And look at where we are today in terms of, I remember the first Malabar exercise, and you can see the last Malabar exercise where you had almost all the Quad countries, I think, participating, right? And so I'm a big proponent of deepening the US-India relationship. During NSCAI, we argued that US and India need to have a tech alliance. I know that the word alliance doesn't go well on both camps, but honestly, I'm bullish about that, and I think we should call it out. Tech alliance doesn't mean automatically a military alliance or some kind of a new NATO alliance that people allude to. Tech alliance, I think it's a natural next step for US and India. Why? Look at what happens among the private sector actors, both here and in India. Most of our tech sector leaders have been either of Indian origins or were born in India, right? The people-to-people side is a tremendous value asset in our relationship, right? The technology side. India has some of the best tech companies in the world. We have some of the best tech companies in the world. Why can we not do more in that space, right? India has some of the best universities in the world. We have some of the best universities in the world. Why can we not have more and more Indian students study in the United States and, stay here or return to India? Because I think it's a net plus for both countries, right? So there's a huge potential. But I think we have to move into that next natural step, which is, I think, which I call it openly a tech alliance, right? And I think there's a huge potential there to remove any existing barriers, whether it's like, I know how many times Indians have struggled with the visas, with being accepted in American universities, but not being able to come on time because of visa issues. All these things are being worked out, and there are barriers on both sides because bureaucracy never moves fast. But I think the next natural step for us is really to move into that technology alliance framework, where then you can expand the biotech space more. You can expand the hardware space more. If there's space to expand the military space, of course we should do that, because I mentioned the space now with satellites, where India is really a serious actor, and obviously the United States is a leading actor. It provides an ample space, no pun intended, for us to expand our relationship.
Yeah, and the way I think, my 2 cents on that, really, also is that and I'm as bullish on the U.S. India partnership, I think, as you are, and have been now for several decades. I was telling you about my earlier work as well. I think the talent piece, I think, is a critical piece. The technology piece is obviously a critical piece, and I think as part of that, a lot more R&D collaborations got to happen. I think that's not
100%.
enough.
100%.
I think so that core tech development can also be happening, whether it's in space, whether it's in quantum, whether it's in other aspects of the tech supply chains, in clean energy, batteries, etc. And of course, India is very well positioned to do it. I think usually, like, the big advantage India brings is scale and
Absolutely.
mass production, and then a lot of that can then apply to other countries in the global south, right? And to cover up gaps that you were mentioning, that China is sometimes very easily eased into, because that space was given to them, etc. And I think finally I would say that ultimately, I think that political and strategic
Alignment.
alignment, absolutely. I think that this is really a partnership for the long term future,
I
right?
agree. I agree.
And not for like just say 2 for 5 years,
Yeah.
but really a multi-decade partnership. At
I
least.
agree. The one thing I would add, one advice I always give to my Indian friend is, India is known as a software country, right?
Yeah.
It produces some of the best software in the world. But as companies are leaving China for many reasons, right? India has to become a hardware country because it has the scale, it has the know-how, but it has to move into becoming a hardware country as well, or a hardware nation. Because then I think it will become like such an attractive country for all these companies that are looking for places to move their manufacturing capabilities out of China. And so I think that is the next muscle that I would argue that India has to build in terms of moving forward this century.
No, absolutely, absolutely agreed. And I think that that's been core, core to the debates here. That do you remain largely a services and software nation, or do you also become a hardware and manufacturing nation? And I think for various guests I've had on the podcast, whether they've been economists or strategic thinkers or military folks or private sector guys, pretty much everyone's aligned, whether you're Indian or otherwise, that India cannot choose to be one or the other. You've got to be both. I think much
agree.
like the US, I think you're as much a software player as a hardware player. And you might have weaknesses and relative strengths and
Absolutely.
weaknesses, but that doesn't mean that you choose one or the other. I don't think we
Exactly.
live in a world where at a country that of the
Yeah.
scale, much
Yeah.
like the US or India
Yeah.
is, you don't choose. I think you have to be there in both. Let me now briefly, I know we've already exceeded the time we've
No
envisioned,
problem.
but I want to sort of jump up to the global governance piece of this, right? So,
Okay.
AI, as it's evolving, whether in its military applications or its commercial applications, or even just thinking on AI ethics and responsible AI, and conversations like that you've also alluded to. Do you, very practically speaking, Ili, expect that there'll be some kind of global governance of AI that we can anticipate in the next 3 to 5 years, or will it remain largely ungoverned because it's at the core of competition, and no one wants to be restrained, when the stakes are so high and competition at its peak?
No, I mean, look, this is a really good question. And honestly, I don't think anybody knows the right answer to that one, because I think I can argue both camps. I think if you look some of the certain models of how we have regulated technology in the past, I think it can be done. If there's enough general goodwill internationally and especially among the key actors,
There
to
is.
agree. I understand. But even in the previous technologies, people disagreed, and then eventually they came to like a set of rules and regulations. Think about the nuclear weapons. Think about
Yeah.
radiology equipment. I just hosted here a book by one of my old mentors, Daniel Server. He's a professor at Johns Hopkins here, who writes about this organization that existed for 100+ years, that came up with the radiology, rules and governance principles, and it has been operated without much of the global attention in a professional way for more than 100 years, right? And you can only imagine when radiology or the X-ray equipment first came to life, how people view it, the risk that it came with, to humans and everything else. So there are models if there's enough general goodwill among key players and key actors. That's number one. Number two is you talked about this, but the challenge of this being developed by private sector and then have government or some kind of a international governing body coming on top of that to regulate it, which I think is a difficult challenge, especially in the competitive environment in which you have, a country with a set of companies that are ahead and company that is not being transparent about the goals and ambitions. So that could be really challenging. I think if we have some set of governing principles that are high-level principles, that could be good enough, right? Because then it would allow countries to develop based on their culture, based on their understanding, based on the technological advancement, a rules and regulation for their own people, right? For their own nation. I think right now everybody is like in this wild chasing what's going to be the next couple of steps. You have countries that are moving into the proprietary mode, that they believe more in these proprietary models. You have countries that are moving more into the open source mode. I was in India, and I saw a lot of enthusiasm for the open source models in India. And so, I think this is still going to continue for maybe 1 year or two until we see how far these models are going, and whether or not we get closer to some kind of a super intelligence model that then will take us to take a completely different approach, because we will face something that no humans have ever faced before. We will face a model that is as smart as any human being. And so then that will launch a completely new debate about what kind of a governance structure you need and the right and left limits on that kind of a technology.
Yeah, but for the meanwhile, I think, what I'm getting from you also is the sense I also have is that in the immediate short term, and let's say in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, we're going to have to, I think, ultimately contain ourselves to just principles and general guidances, but not really any kind of treaties or real enforceable agreements, right? Much like on cyber warfare or on AI. Because my sense is that you're not going to have, at least at the global level, maybe at a regional democratic
blocks.
Could anticipate something, and there are all these AI summits that have been happening in South Korea, and the Bletchley Summit, and now the one coming up in France.
Yeah.
So one could anticipate that maybe for certain select countries of the world, you come together, the ones who are aligned on principle.
Yeah. The way we talk about this is you have like a 4-tier level of countries, right? Number one is, for United States, with our closest allies, and generally here we talk about the Five Eyes plus maybe Japan and Korea, is you set the security protocols, you set up the infrastructure required for these models to become better and better, because some of these countries are good in energy, like Canada. Some of these are good in hardware, like Taiwan, Japan. So you have a set of countries in the tier 1. Tier 2 are countries that aspire to become part of the tier 1 club, but they have a little work to do in terms of security protocols, their infrastructure build up and whatnot. But they are democracies in its foundation. They believe in rule of law, the general principles of how, open societies are run nowadays, right? And so third categories are
what are the countries in category 2?
Well, non-NATO allies probably. Here I would argue probably countries in Southeast Asia, certain countries in Europe that are still not part of the close alliance that we have in place. And then the third category is what probably would be the countries that belong in the global south, even though I hate that term, but the countries that if the first 2 tiers have a better offer than the Chinese offer, then you can bring those countries aboard because they believe in the values. They want to have a better economy. They want to have a better education. They want to have, human rights and everything, but they're caught in between this tech competition between, the West or the democratic countries in China. And then the last categories are countries that I think they will never get. Actually, they are getting together to build an opposing bloc against, the first 2 categories, right? And so that's how I think we talk about it here at the SCSP in terms of the 4 tiers of countries or the 4-tier alliances and partnerships you need for the AI future.
The fourth one, just to be clear, is countries that you don't expect to be
Uh,
partners.
uh,
What's that
there
fourth
are
tier?
countries that are building an alternative vision for the future of these technologies, and they, at the root cause, they want to actually compete and win over the category number 1 and 2, right?
That's
So
primarily China, or do you expect
China,
other?
Russia, North Korea, and Iran.
Yeah, the access.
Yeah.
Got it. No, great. This has been great. I think, Ylli, I think fascinating conversation. We got into the nitty gritty of many of the things that I think you think about day to day. I know there's a lot more that we could cover, and you and I could keep going at this. I think
Yeah, that's
a
true.
lot of common interests and questions brewing in our minds. So thanks for taking the time. We end every podcast with two very short, quick questions, which is basically one, given the topics and the kinds of themes we have discussed, a book that you recommend to our listeners. It can be more than one. And second, podcast guest or two who you would recommend as well.
Great, good questions. Obviously, I listen to a lot of podcasts because there's a lot of good conversations happening in the podcast.
Sure.
The last one that is really intriguing to me, obviously, I love everything from The Economist. I think we both agree that they produce some of the best podcasts out there. But the one that is produced now with this new technology, it's called Deep Dive on
Yeah.
AI. And I mean, you've seen it, a 10-minute podcast that are done by Notebook LM, I think. It's fascinating, right? Because they really summarize in 10 minutes everything you missed in a day or two on topics that are, interesting for you and me. In terms of books, I mean, there are a lot of books, to be honest with you, that have been written on this topic. The one that really blew my mind, it was a couple of years ago. It was The Technology Trap. I don't know if you've read that one, but it's an incredible book. It talks about
It's
electricity.
that's Carl's book, right? Yeah, I think.
Yeah, Carl's. Yeah, and it talks about the origins of the electricity and the impact that it had in the economy and society, and then it talks about the employment and labor. But that one, I would say, really opened my eyes about the pace and the change and how long does it take for these technologies to have a meaningful change in the society, right? Another
Yeah.
one is Power and Prediction by a professor from University of Toronto, Ajay, I think. He's a friend of mine too. But even that book talks about how long did it take for the electricity really to become scalable and to influence people's lives and everything. And I like them because maybe a lot of these questions we have right now about AI and what it's going to bring to our society and the future of work, the future of employment, and everything else. And so it's always good to go back and
Yeah.
reread what happened when other technologies were introduced in the world.
Yeah, and how the world dealt with them then. Of course,
Yeah,
correct.
yeah,
No,
yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
What about podcast guests you recommend? Of the kind of people, I'm sure there's a lot of people thinking about competitiveness,
Yeah.
nations, US and others. Who are some of the people that you've worked with outside of SCSP,
Um,
who you think are some of the best thinkers on these topics?
Ramsey Brown is probably a not regular guest that you would invite, but I think we had him in our one of the first podcasts because he wrote a piece about the future of labor in 2027 that blew my mind. And Ramsey leads a company, and I highly recommend Ramsey as a podcast guest.
Oh, great. I'll look him up. I have not actually
Yeah,
come across him, so thanks for that
and we'll put you in
recommendation.
touch if you need. But I love how he talks about these things.
Yeah, and what about people from the private sector who are
Yeah.
thinking in a way that's aligned with how governments and the DoD and SCSP might be thinking? Who are some of the people from the private sector who are thinking in ways that are
Yeah.
aligned with
Yeah.
this vision that you have?
Chris Darby, former the head of InQtel, now with the Cerberus Fund. He's a great thinker, great leader, who has spent most of his career in private sector thinking about how that technology can have a dual purpose for government.
No, amazing, great. Thanks so much for the recommendations, Ylli. I'll
Of course.
look a couple of these folks up who I'm not familiar
And we'll
with.
put you in touch if you need contacts. Please let me know.
I will, and goes without saying, of course. Whenever you are in India next, or I'm back in DC, I would love to meet in person and
Likewise.
continue the conversation. Thanks so much.
Absolutely.